My name's Mark Ellis, and I'd driven all this way to Pinewood County, Ohio, because I'm a sucker for animals and because my bank account had exactly $43 in it. The job posting promised immediate start and competitive pay, whatever that means in the middle of nowhere. The only specific detail was this phrase: must strictly adhere to facility regulations. My father taught me exactly 2 things before he checked out emotionally. 1, follow the damn rules, Mark. And 2, dogs don't talk back. He never explained that second one, but I figured it out when my mother walked out when I was 9. Our house turned into a museum of silence after that. Just me, Dad, and his dog-eared copy of You Should Have Been Born a Tougher Kid, which he never actually read but kept on the coffee table like a threat. So yeah, I had daddy issues, mommy issues, empty wallet issues, the works. But the one thing I knew for certain was that I had a way with broken animals. The 3-legged cat that hissed at everyone else. She'd purr in my lap. The pit bull that cowered when people raised their voices. He'd follow me around like I hung the moon. These animals didn't care that I was damaged goods. They just needed someone gentle, and I could be that, at least. Which brings us to me, killing the engine in the gravel lot of Pinewood County Animal Rescue at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. The building squatted there like a cement bunker, with a single porch light that flickered like it was sending distress signals in Morse code. I pocketed my keys, forced myself to breathe, and stepped out. A weathered sign hung above the door. Pinewood County Animal Rescue, the paint peeling off in strips like dead skin. Next to it, a newer, official-looking placard declared, "Closed to the public." That struck me as weird. Most shelters survive on donations and adoptions. They want visitors. This place seemed allergic to them. The job listing had been vague but enticing. Rural location, unique cases, strict regulations. In retrospect, those should have been red flags the size of bedsheets. Before I could reach for the door handle, it swung open. A woman stood in the threshold. She was tall, slender, with copper-red hair pulled into a severe bun that looked like it was giving her a headache. "Mr. Ellis?" "That's me," I replied, trying to sound confident. "I'm here about the night shift position." She stepped aside to let me in. "I'm Dr. Morrow. I oversee the specialized care unit." Her gray eyes assessed me like I was a specimen under a microscope. "You're late." The lobby was sparse, concrete floors, institutional green walls, and a desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a closed-down elementary school. No cheerful posters of puppies and kittens, no donation box, no brochures about heartworm prevention. "Sorry," I mumbled. "GPS issues." "Understandable. Technology tends to malfunction around Pinewood. Your family has roots here, don't they?" she asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Not that I know of. Curious. The name Ellis has significance in Pinewood County. From somewhere deep in the building came a sound I couldn't quite identify. A keening wail that could have been an animal in pain or machinery desperately in need of oil. Dr. Morrow didn't even blink, but I noticed how her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the clipboard she carried. "Mr. Chambers will be with you shortly to discuss your duties. In the meantime, perhaps you'd like to tell me why you're here." The job? "I need work, and I'm good with animals." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Everyone who comes to Pinewood has a story, Mr. Ellis. A reason they're willing to work in a place so remote. What's yours?" Before I could cobble together an answer that didn't scream desperate and broke, a door opened down the hall. A man emerged, tall, with a shaved head that reflected the overhead light like a polished skull. He wore a pristine lab coat, the kind a doctor might wear if they were auditioning for a horror movie villain. "Mr. Ellis," he said, voice as smooth as glass. "I am Mr. Chambers, the facility manager." He extended a single sheet of paper toward me. "These are the regulations. You will do well to memorize them." I accepted the document, a single page titled Staff Regulations, typed in a font that screamed corporate sociopath. Then Mr. Chambers set it down on the desk and pinned it in place with a stapler, almost violently, like he wanted to drive the point home. Without another word, he glided into the hallway and disappeared. Dr. Morrow watched him go, her expression unreadable. You'll find Mr. Chambers efficient. He prefers rules to relationships. She lowered her voice. He knew your grandfather, you know. The comment hit me like a splash of ice water. My grandfather? I never met him. Yes, James Ellis. A brilliant man. Such a tragedy. Before I could ask what the hell she meant by that, I spotted a second note, half hidden under that stapled page. The handwriting on it screamed, written while looking over my shoulder. Mark, I'm sorry. The bloodline always returns. Don't trust what they tell you about your grandfather. Nothing says, you've made a fantastic life decision, quite like a cryptic note from your predecessor. With a sinking feeling, I lifted the typed rules. Never remove an animal from its enclosure until it has fully awakened on its own. If an animal speaks, do not respond with sympathy or agreement. If you find human remains on the premises, report them in the daily log and move on. Do not investigate further. If you hear scratching behind the supply closet at night, do not open it under any circumstances. Always offer food at precisely the posted times. No more, no less. Do not euthanize any animal without signed permission, even if it begs you. I let out what was supposed to be a laugh but came out like the whimper of a kicked puppy. Human bones. Animals that speak. I'd worked at shelters where the biggest crisis was running out of kibble. This place had protocols for what to do if Fido started reciting Shakespeare. Dr. Morrow was watching me, her head tilted slightly, like my reaction was data she was collecting. Is there a problem, Mr. Ellis? This has to be a joke, I said, waving the paper. Animals don't talk. And what's this about human remains? Something flickered across her face. Caution, maybe, or calculation. The regulations are precautionary. Think of them as folklore. Every workplace has its myths, doesn't it? She smiled thinly. Though I should warn you, Pinewood County has a rich oral tradition. The locals believe this land remembers things. Old things. Hungry things. I stared at her. Are you trying to scare me off? On the contrary. She took a step closer, her perfume weirdly clinical, like disinfectant disguised as flowers. I'm trying to prepare you. This facility deals with unique cases, animals with specialized needs. The rules may seem strange, but they serve a purpose. She glanced at my hands, which were clutching the regulations so tightly the paper had wrinkled. The question is, Mr. Ellis, can you follow them, even when your instincts tell you otherwise? From further inside the building, I heard what sounded like a man's voice raised in argument, quickly hushed. Dr. Morrow's eyes darted toward the sound, a flash of irritation crossing her face before she composed herself. We have differing opinions about methodology here, she said carefully, but the rules remain constant. Part of me, the part with a functioning survival instinct, screamed to bolt back to my car and drive until this place was just a weird story to tell at bars. But reality check. My apartment was 3 months behind on rent. My resume was thinner than gas station toilet paper. And somewhere in my DNA lurked my father's voice ready to label me a coward. Plus, there was that old guilt lodged between my ribs. The memory of a dog named Buddy lying on blacktop while teenage me stood frozen. I had failed that helpless animal once. I couldn't walk away from others, even if those others might talk back. So I squared my shoulders, trying to look braver than the kid who still slept with the bathroom light on, and said, I'm here to help. Dr. Morrow's eyes gleamed with something I couldn't name. Satisfaction, maybe, or anticipation. Excellent. Your shift begins now. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the facility. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mark? Your grandfather often said the same thing when faced with difficult choices. I wonder if you'll make the same ones he did. With that cryptic warning hanging in the air, she disappeared down the corridor, leaving me alone in the lobby, with a set of rules that belonged in a Lovecraftian dream sequence, and a gnawing suspicion that I'd just made a terrible mistake. The neon clock on the wall read 10:02 p.m. My shift had officially started at 9 p.m., but there wasn't exactly a crowd of colleagues waiting to chew me out. I wasn't just 30 minutes late. I was over an hour behind schedule. That was some welcome for my first night of work, a Tuesday I'd never forget. So I did what any new hire would do. I went looking for a break room, staff lockers, or anything resembling normalcy. But this building was a middle finger to architectural logic. Hallways veered off at angles that defied the building's outer shape. Doors opened to more corridors that sometimes dead-ended or looped back on themselves like an Escher drawing. As I turned a corner, I nearly collided with a small, wiry woman with dishwater blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore scrubs with faded stains that I hoped were just iodine. Shit. She jumped back, clutching a clipboard to her chest. You must be the new guy, Ellis, right? Mark, I said, extending my hand. And you are? Cheryl. I left you that note. She glanced nervously over her shoulder. Look, we can't talk long. They're always watching. But I had to warn you. About what? And what did you mean about my bloodline? Her eyes widened. You don't know? God, they didn't even tell you. Of course they didn't. She lowered her voice to a whisper. Your grandfather worked here too. He tried to shut this place down in the 80s. And he paid for it. Before I could ask more, a door slammed somewhere nearby. Cheryl jumped like she'd been electrocuted. I can't be seen with you, not yet. But check the old files in the records room if you get a chance. Look for anything with the word covenant on it. She started to hurry away, then turned back. And Mark, whatever you do, don't sign anything, no matter what they say it is. She hurried off, leaving me with more questions than answers. The fact that both Dr. Morrow and Cheryl had mentioned my grandfather couldn't be coincidence. And what kind of animal shelter requires people to sign covenants? I continued exploring, eventually finding a hallway lined with enclosures. What struck me wasn't what I heard, but what I didn't hear. Normal shelters sound like a rock concert of barks, meows, and cage rattling. This place? Silent as a funeral home at midnight. I swallowed a lump that felt like a golf ball and approached the first enclosure. Inside huddled a small terrier mix, its whole body vibrating like it was standing in an Arctic wind. Its fur looked like someone had taken a weed whacker to it, and I caught the sharp hospital smell coming from its bandaged leg. Hey there, buddy, I whispered. But instead of being scared like most shelter dogs, the dog just stared back, studying me, like I was the one in the cage. As I moved on, checking each enclosure, I noticed something odd about the walls. Faint markings etched into the concrete. Not graffiti, but deliberate patterns, swirls and lines that formed shapes just beyond recognition. When I traced them with my fingertips, they felt warm, almost feverish, like the building itself was running a temperature. Then, near the end of that hallway, something white caught my eye. A femur. A human bone. Yellowed with tatters of denim still clinging to it like some grotesque fashion statement. It lay just outside an enclosure whose occupant remained hidden in darkness. My first thought was, this is a prank, some sick initiation ritual. Then the smell hit me, that slightly sweet odor that anyone who's ever found roadkill recognizes instantly. Clearly the human bone wasn't something from a Halloween store's discount bin. My muscles locked up like I'd touched a live wire. Run, scream, call 911. Then those rules flashed before my eyes. If you find human remains on the premises, report them in the daily log and move on. Do not investigate further. Sure, some shelters have policies about cleaning litter boxes, and this place has protocols for stumbling across partial skeletons. I glanced at the enclosure, half expecting some demon dog to lunge at the bars, but all I heard was soft breathing from the shadows. I'd promised myself I'd stick this out, log it and move on, I repeated like a mantra, swallowing bile. But first, I had to find that log. I turned to leave, forcing my jelly legs to move. That's when I heard it, a sound like someone gargling gravel. I spun around. The shape in the enclosure shifted into the dim light, revealing a skinny mutt with ribs showing through patchy fur. Its eyes seemed almost intelligent. It coughed once, then whispered in a voice like sandpaper on stone. The others were more afraid than you. The last one, she screamed. But not you. You've been waiting for this your whole life. Haven't you, Ellis? Time stopped. My father always said I had the reflexes of a dead sloth, and he was right. I just stood there, jaw hanging, brain short-circuiting like a toaster in a bathtub. Did that dog just talk? Rule number 2 flashed in neon behind my eyelids. If an animal speaks, do not respond with sympathy or agreement. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. The dog hacked again, eyes watering, then laid its head on its paws with a sigh that carried the weight of surrender. But before it turned away, it whispered something else that froze the blood in my veins. Ellis bloodline. You're part of their covenant now, just like all the others they've fed to us. Ellis bloodline? How did this animal know my name? I backed away. What covenant? What was this place? I stumbled down the corridor until I found a cramped office, furnished with a desk that had seen better decades. The computer's ancient screensaver bounced the words "Welcome to P-Car" in blocky letters that changed color every few seconds. Beside the keyboard sat a spiral notebook labeled Daily Log. The pen attached to it had been chewed on both ends, which seemed like the kind of detail a horror movie would zoom in on right before the jump scare. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, Date, October 3rd. Personnel, Mark Ellis. Time, 10:30 p.m. Notes, found a human femur near enclosure number 12. Logged it per protocol. The occupant of enclosure number 12 spoke. Followed rule number 2. I stared at my own chicken scratch handwriting. Then I added one more line. No further incident to report, because sure, we're just going to casually skip over a dog mentioned my family name part. The rules said log the bones, move on. But as I closed the notebook, my eye caught on an entry from earlier that week, Cheryl's last log. Date, September 30th. Personnel, Cheryl Winters. Time, 3:17 a.m. Notes. Found Dr. Morrow's journal in the restricted archive. May God forgive us for what we've done here. The Ellis bloodline was never supposed to be part of this. We'll try to warn him. Note, Dr. Lambert continues to argue against using the Ellises. Says we're trading one horror for another. Chambers doesn't care. Says blood is blood and one family's suffering is worth it. My breath caught in my throat. The Ellis bloodline. There it was again. And who was Dr. Lambert? Another doctor here questioning whatever the hell they were doing? I flipped back through the log, searching for more mentions of my name. Nothing. Just mundane entries about feeding schedules, medication doses, and the occasional cryptic reference to containment protocols and boundary reinforcement. I sat back in the chair, my mind racing. Why would my family name be mentioned in this godforsaken place? My father had never spoken about our ancestors or family history. No old photo albums, no stories passed down through generations. It was as if our history began and ended with him, a closed book with torn-out pages. Except once. Once, when I was about 12, I'd found him staring at an old, faded photograph of a stern-faced man. When I asked who it was, Dad had snatched the photo away, saying only, "My father, your grandfather, a weak man who couldn't do what needed to be done." Then he'd burned the photo in the kitchen sink while I watched, confused and a little scared. The office suddenly felt too small, too close, but I needed to keep moving, to distract myself from the growing suspicion that I hadn't just stumbled into this job by chance. Around midnight, Wednesday night going into Thursday, I decided to do something practical. Check water bowls, make sure everyone was still breathing. You know, basic attendant stuff that didn't involve talking dogs or femurs. That's when I found a door labeled High Risk Authorized Personnel Only. Since I was technically staff now, I figured that included me. So I turned the knob. The smell hit me first, antiseptic with an underlying sharpness that burned my nostrils like ammonia. The lights were dimmer in here, deliberately so. I walked past a row of enclosures that made the ones outside look like luxury condos. Reinforced steel mesh, triple locks, and a tray of sedation equipment that wouldn't be out of place in a maximum security prison. My pulse pounded in my ears like a war drum. The first few enclosures contained animals that looked either heavily drugged or halfway to the taxidermist. A cat missing fur in patches that revealed raw pink skin. A dog with an IV drip snaking into its leg. And, I swear on whatever's holy, Some creature that looked like a raccoon and a lizard had a baby after a wild night of bad decisions. All of them breathed so shallowly, I had to watch for a full minute to make sure they weren't already dead. But just then, I heard voices from further down the corridor, hushed but intense. I froze, pressing myself against the wall. Another failure rate like the others, a man was saying, his voice tense with frustration. We need the full bloodline, not just samples. The samples from the grandfather's remains have degraded, came Dr. Morrow's unmistakable voice. We knew this day would come. That's why we called him here. He won't consent. This voice was new, deeper, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Not after what happened to James. You know what that means. The unwilling sacrifice is always more potent, said Chambers, sounding almost pleased. Like his grandfather, if necessary. For God's sake, listen to yourselves, the accented voice hissed. We used to be scientists. Now we're what? Cult priests? Sacrificing people to keep some thing contained? This isn't what I signed up for. You signed the same covenant we all did, Lambert, Chambers replied coldly. Your family chose their role, as did the Ellises and the others. The difference is that your line follows orders. The Ellises have always been problematic. The subjects are showing increased cognitive function, Dr. Morrow interrupted, clearly trying to change the subject. Subject 8 is nearly ready. Another week, perhaps. We don't have a week, Chambers said. The boundary thins with each passing day. If we don't reinforce it before the new moon. Their voices faded as they moved away. I stood frozen, trying to process what I'd overheard. Sacrifices? Boundaries? My grandfather? It sounded like the ravings of lunatics, except it aligned too perfectly with the strange rules, the talking dog's warning, and Cheryl's cryptic note. When I was sure they were gone, I continued down the corridor, even more cautious now. At the row's end stood an enclosure covered with a black tarp. Scrawled across the fabric in what looked like Sharpie was a warning. Do not remove the covering without manager approval. My father always said my curiosity would get me killed someday. Like the time I stuck my hand in old man Grayson's yard to pet his beware of dog Rottweiler. But the rules didn't specifically mention tarps. And then I heard it. A soft whimper from beneath the black fabric. An animal in pain. My caretaker instincts overrode my sense of self-preservation. I lifted just the corner of the tarp, just enough to peek. What I saw will haunt me until the day they put me in the ground. At first glance, it resembled a large cat, maybe a lynx, but its face was wrong. Its muzzle was shortened, almost human-like, with lips that could form shapes a normal cat's mouth never could. Its eyes reflected the dim light, but behind that animal shine, they had human irises, hazel with flecks of gold. The rest of its body wore coarse fur, except for raw patches that oozed clear fluid. It sucked in a rattling breath. Then, in a voice like twigs snapping underfoot, it said, "End it. Let me die." You know that scene in every horror movie where the idiot protagonist drops the flashlight? That was me. I jerked back so hard I nearly fell on my ass. Everything screamed, close the tarp and run, but I stayed frozen. Because I'm an idiot with a savior complex the size of Texas. The creature stared at me with eyes too human and a face too animal. A smell wafted from its mouth, like hamburger left in a hot car for 3 days. Kill me, please, it rasped. Then its eyes narrowed, focusing more clearly on my face. You're Ellis, the last of the Covenant line. My skin went cold. What do you mean? What covenant? The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a grimace or a smile. Your grandfather, he knew. He broke the pact. Now, we all pay. What pact? I pressed, my voice barely above a whisper. What does my family have to do with this place? The creature's breathing grew more labored. Blood binds. Blood breaks. Your blood can end this. It shifted, trying to move closer to the bars. I was human once, like you. My name was Emily Vaughn. I signed their papers. Volunteered, they said. Didn't know. What for? A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the bars to stay upright. This thing hadn't just been an animal transformed. It had been a person, a woman named Emily. "I can't believe it," I whispered. "What did they do to you?" Her eyes, so human within that twisted face, filled with tears. "Made me vessel for what lies beyond. Your grandfather tried to stop them, tried to save others like me. They killed him, absorbed him into the threshold." A noise from the hallway made me jump, footsteps approaching rapidly. I let the tarp fall back, my mind reeling from Emily's revelations. I barely had time to step away before Dr. Morrow rounded the corner, her face a mask of professional detachment that didn't quite hide the suspicion in her eyes. "Mr. Ellis," she said coolly, "I see you found our isolation ward." I swallowed hard, just getting the lay of the land. Her eyes flicked to the tarp-covered enclosure, then back to me. "This area houses our most challenging cases. I'd appreciate if you'd focus your attention on the main ward until you're more acclimated to our protocols." "Of course," I managed, trying to sound casual. "Just checking water levels." She smiled, a thin curve of lips that never reached her eyes. "How thoughtful. But these specimens are on specialized hydration schedules." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Between us, Mr. Ellis, there's more at stake here than animal welfare. These subjects are the frontier of neurobiological research. What we learn here could revolutionize human medicine by turning people into that." I nodded toward Emily's cage before I could stop myself. Dr. Morrow's expression hardened. "Transitions can be difficult. Sacrifices must be made for progress." Her eyes bored into mine with frightening intensity. "Your grandfather understood that, at first, before he became sentimental. Is that what you call having a conscience?" Her laugh was like ice cracking. "Conscience? Such a limiting construct. The truly ethical view is to consider the greater good, the advancement of knowledge that will benefit billions." She gestured around us. "These few subjects might suffer, yes, but their pain purchases understanding beyond your imagination." "That's what all the monsters say," I said before I could stop myself. Something dangerous flickered in her eyes, quickly suppressed. "You sound exactly like him." She brushed invisible lint from her sleeve. "Dr. Lambert has expressed interest in meeting you. He knew your grandfather quite well." She studied my face carefully. "I advised against it, of course. Lambert has unorthodox views about our work here, but I thought you should know he might approach you." Before I could cobble together a response, she disappeared into the isolation ward, the door closing behind her with a soft click. In the hallway, I paced on wobbling legs, adrenaline making me dizzy. I wanted to throw up, or sob, or find something lethal and put Emily out of her misery. But the rules weren't just suggestions. They carried an unspoken threat I could feel in my marrow. I didn't write about Emily in the log. I couldn't. Instead, I scribbled, "Quarantine enclosure number 6, occupant stable. No action needed." Then I slammed the book shut, cursing under my breath. First day on the job, and I'd already collected enough nightmare fuel to power me through a lifetime of insomnia. But more disturbing than seeing Emily herself were her words. "Your grandfather knew. He broke the pact. My blood. My family. Somehow I wasn't just a random hire. I was connected to this place in ways I couldn't begin to understand. At least it seemed like there was one person here, this Dr. Lambert, who might be willing to tell me the truth, and I was about to meet him sooner than I expected. I finished my first official night shift as dawn broke over the cornfields, the pale Wednesday morning light, doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled in my bones. The facility hummed with a different energy during daylight hours, fewer shadows to hide in, but somehow more secrets. No one had told me where to go or what to do once my shift ended at 8 a.m. There seemed to be an unspoken assumption that I would remain on the premises, like everyone else who moved through these halls with the glazed eyes of people who rarely saw the outside world. Unable to imagine sleeping after everything I'd witnessed, sometime around noon on Wednesday, I finally found the break room and discovered a coffee maker that looked like it had been salvaged from a 1982 garage sale. It gurgled and spat out a liquid that resembled motor oil but smelled vaguely of coffee. I was desperate enough to drink it anyway. As I sat there, nursing my toxic sludge and contemplating the surreal nightmare my life had become. A tall, lean man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses entered. He wore a lab coat like the others, but his was rumpled, and he carried himself with less rigid formality than Chambers or Morrow. "Mark Ellis," he said, more statement than question. "I'm Dr. Lambert. We need to talk." I examined him warily. This was the man I'd heard arguing with Chambers and Morrow, the one who seemed to oppose whatever they were planning for me. About what? He glanced over his shoulder, then closed the break room door. "About your grandfather. About what they're not telling you." He pulled up a chair, sitting close enough that he could keep his voice low. "James Ellis was my mentor when I first came to Pinewood. A brilliant man. And contrary to what they might have implied, he wasn't crazy or reckless. He discovered what they were really doing here, and he tried to stop it." "And what exactly are they doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Lambert's expression darkened. "Creating vessels. Hybrid forms that can house consciousness from outside our reality. A threshold exists in Pinewood County, a thin spot between our world and somewhere else. Entities from that elsewhere want in. Your ancestors made a covenant generations ago to help maintain the boundary, to keep those entities contained. Using our blood," I said, the words from the talking dog and Emily coming back to me. He nodded grimly. "Ellis blood has unique properties, a genetic marker that helps stabilize the barrier. But over time, the leadership here became less interested in containment and more interested in controlled integration. They started experimenting with creating vessels that could house these outside consciousnesses." "Like Emily Vaughn," I whispered. Lambert's expression shifted, growing guarded. "You've met her? Already? That's unexpected." He ran a hand through his hair. "Yes, like Emily. She was a volunteer for what she thought was a drug trial. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. And my grandfather? James discovered they were using human subjects, not just animals. He tried to expose them, to shut it down. Instead Lambert faltered. They performed a ritual, used his blood and essence to reinforce the barrier. But something went wrong. James's consciousness wasn't fully absorbed. He exists now as part of the threshold itself, neither fully here nor fully there. The coffee turned to acid in my stomach. And now they want to do the same to me? No, worse. They want to use you to complete what they started with your grandfather, to fully dissolve his remaining consciousness into the threshold matrix. They believe that with the direct descendant's blood, your blood, freely given, they can finally silence his resistance. Why are you telling me this? Why help me? Lambert's eyes met mine and I saw genuine regret there. Because I've been complicit too long. Because James was right and I was a coward. And because my family made a covenant of our own. The Lamberts were meant to be the conscience of this place, to ensure the boundaries were maintained ethically. He gave a bitter laugh. Some job I've done. Something in his tone made me hesitate. He seemed earnest, but was he telling me everything? If your family was supposed to be the ethical watchdog, why did things go so wrong? Lambert's face tightened. We compromised, generation by generation, small concessions that seemed reasonable at the time. His voice dropped. My father allowed the first animal experiments. I permitted the first voluntary human trials. He looked away. It's easy to justify atrocities in the name of knowledge. And now I'm trying to make it right. But I need you to understand something, Mark. Everyone here has their own agenda. Even me. His gaze returned to mine, painfully direct. I want to shut this place down, yes. But I also want to save what can be saved. Some of the research, it could help people. Real medicine, not this abomination factory Chambers has created. A thought occurred to me. You said freely given, so they can't just take my blood, right? I'd have to consent. For the ritual to work properly, yes. But Chambers has contingency plans, ways to extract what they need that don't require your consent. Less effective, but still viable. He leaned closer. Mark, you need to get out of here, tonight. before the new moon rises tomorrow. What happens at the new moon? The barrier thins naturally. It's when they perform their rituals, when the threshold is most accessible. He slipped a key card from his pocket and pressed it into my palm. This will get you into the restricted archives. Find your grandfather's journal. It contains information about a counter ritual, a way to permanently close the threshold rather than just maintain it. It's what James was working on when they caught him. I pocketed the card, my heart pounding. Why don't you leave? Come with me. A sad smile crossed his face. My bloodline is bound to this place too, just differently. I've tried to leave before. The boundary, it pulls you back, finds ways to return you. But you're new to the covenant. There might still be a chance for you. He stood. I have to go. Mara will be looking for me. Be careful who you trust here, Mark. Even those who seem helpful may have agendas of their own. As he reached the door, I called after him. Dr. Lambert? What about the animals, the normal ones? There are no normal ones here, he said quietly. Just those not yet transformed. His voice dropped to a whisper. But some are more valuable than others. The ones in Section C, they have genetic markers similar to humans with psychic abilities. Chambers believes they make ideal vessels. After he left, I sat there, trying to process everything he'd told me. Could I trust him? He seemed sincere, but he'd admitted his own complicity, his own agenda. This whole place was a masterclass in hiding horrific truths behind professional veneers. I decided to check the archives. Whether Lambert was helping me or setting me up, the answers I needed would be there. The restricted archives were located in a windowless room behind a key-carded door on the administrative floor. Lambert's card worked, granting me access to a space lined with metal filing cabinets and shelves of leather-bound journals. I went straight for the cabinet marked Ellis J. and began rifling through folders. Most contained dry reports of experiments and barrier monitoring, but in the back, I found a small leather-bound journal with my grandfather's initials embossed on the cover. As I reached for it, the door to the archives swung open. I whirled around, expecting to see Chambers or Morrow, ready with excuses about getting lost. Instead, Cheryl stood there, looking exhausted but determined. I've been looking for you, she said, shutting the door quickly behind her. Lambert told me he spoke to you. You know Lambert? We're part of the same faction here. Those who want to end the covenant system, not perpetuate it. She nodded at the journal in my hand. Is that James's? I think so. Lambert said it contains information about a counter-ritual. It does. She moved closer, lowering her voice. But we need to hurry. Chambers suspects Lambert of helping you. They're looking for both of you. Something in her tone made me hesitate. She seemed earnest, but there was an intensity to her gaze that felt off. If you're working with Lambert, why did you leave me that cryptic note instead of just telling me the truth? Because they're always watching, she said impatiently. Look, do you want my help or not? The new moon rises tomorrow night. Once that happens, they'll perform their ritual whether you consent or not. I clutched the journal tighter. What kind of help are you offering? A way out. There's a service entrance on the east side that isn't monitored after midnight. I can get you there, help you escape. It sounded too easy. And why would you risk that for me? Something flickered across her face. Irritation, maybe, or calculation. Because your grandfather saved my sister's life, Emily Vaughn, before they changed her. She volunteered for what she thought was a medical study. But when James realized what they were doing, he tried to help her escape. He failed, but he tried. Her voice cracked with what seemed like genuine emotion. I owe him, and that means I owe you. The connection to Emily hit me hard. If Cheryl was her sister, it would explain her determination to help me. Still, Lambert's warning echoed in my mind. Be careful who you trust. Let me read this first, I said, holding up the journal. Then we can talk about escape plans. Disappointment flashed across her features before she composed herself. Fine. But be quick. Meet me in the break room in an hour. She turned to leave, then paused. And Mark? Don't tell anyone else about this. Not even Lambert. He means well, but he's being watched too closely. After she left, I found a quiet corner and opened my grandfather's journal, hoping it contained the answers I so desperately needed. The entries spanned from 1976 to 1984, documenting his slow discovery of Pinewood's true purpose. September 12, 1976. Arrived at Pinewood today to continue the family tradition. Father always said it was our sacred duty to serve here. I grew up on his stories of maintaining the boundary, though he never explained what lay beyond it. The director, Dr. Chambers, Raymond, not his son who will succeed him, welcomed me like a prodigal son. The Ellis line has guarded Pinewood for generations, he said. I felt proud, important. Now I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake. March 3rd, 1977. Something is wrong here. The animals in the restricted ward aren't just sick or injured, they're changed. Dr. Lakeland calls it accelerated evolution. But there's nothing natural about a cat with semi-human features or a dog that can form words. I asked about the purpose of these experiments. The answer was evasive. Boundary reinforcement. What boundary needs monstrosities to maintain it? November 18, 1978. Found the old archives today. Records dating back to 1943, when my grandfather signed something called the Covenant of Guardianship. The document was vague, full of references to the threshold and the world beyond the veil. But the terms were clear. The Ellis bloodline pledged to serve as guardians until the end of time, offering their essence and blood to maintain the seal. In return, those beyond would respect the boundaries of our world. It reads like a peace treaty with something inhuman. February 7th, 1979. I learned today that my father didn't die of a stroke as I was told. He refused to participate in the renewal ritual in 1962. The records indicate he was retired with prejudice. God help me, I think they killed him. And now they watch me constantly, waiting to see if I'll follow in his footsteps or my grandfather's. July 23rd, 1980. Something came through the threshold last night. I glimpsed it only briefly, a shape that seemed to bend the light around it, moving with a liquid grace that made my eyes hurt. They contained it in what they call the vessel, an animal prepared to house consciousness from beyond. The creature that emerged from the containment chamber afterward looked like a wolf, but its eyes, those weren't animal eyes. Dr. Chambers called it a successful integration. I call it an abomination. October 15th, 1981. The renewal ritual approaches. They expect me to donate blood to strengthen the barrier. Simple enough, except I've seen where that blood goes. Into mixtures fed to the hybrid creatures. My blood, the blood of an Ellis, somehow stabilizes the integration process. We're not just guardians, we're catalysts. Our bloodline has some property that allows these fusions to occur without killing the host animals. I feel physically ill at the thought. December 3rd, 1982. I've been documenting everything, gathering evidence of what they're doing here. The experiments have accelerated. It's not just animals anymore. I found a restricted area where the vessels have distinctly human features. They're crossing a line that should never be crossed. When I confronted Chambers, he merely smiled and said, "Progress requires sacrifice, James. Your ancestors understood that." April 18th, 1983. My son turned 9 today. Margaret took him and left me last month. Can't blame her after my increasing paranoia, as she calls it. I haven't told her the truth about Pinewood. It would put her in danger. But I worry for my boy. If something happens to me, the Covenant will eventually call to him. How do I protect him from a fate written in his blood before he was born? August 30th, 1984. I've made my decision. Tonight, I'll release the 3 most human hybrids and destroy as much research as I can. I've mailed copies of my evidence to the FBI, though I doubt they'll believe what they read. If anyone finds this journal, know that the Ellis line was tricked into serving monstrous purposes. We thought we were protecting humanity from what lies beyond the threshold. Instead, we've been helping them create vessels for invasion. My grandfather's covenant was a devil's bargain, and I intend to break it, even if it costs me everything. September 5th, 1984. They caught me. I'm being held in what they call the conditioning chamber. Young Lambert tries to slip me food, water. Good man. I've told him where to find my research on the counter ritual. The threshold can be sealed permanently with Ellis blood, not just maintained. Blood opens, blood closes. The same key that locks can unlock. Remember this. The final entry was dated September 7th, 1984, written in a shaky, almost illegible hand. They come for me tonight. The threshold ritual. My body will die, but they intend to absorb my consciousness into the barrier itself. I've prepared as best I can, focused my thoughts, my will. If I become part of the threshold, I'll fight from within. And to my son, my grandson, any Ellis who might read this, the door swings both ways. Blood that binds can also break. At the new moon, when the barrier is thinnest, Ellis blood freely given with the intent to close rather than maintain can seal the threshold forever. Find the ritual chamber. Speak the words carved above the archway backward. Let your blood fall on the center stone with the will to end, not preserve. I'm sorry for the burden our family carries. I tried to free us. Perhaps you will succeed where I failed. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. My grandfather hadn't just died. He'd been sacrificed, his consciousness absorbed into the very threshold he'd tried to destroy. And now, decades later, I had unwittingly walked into the same trap, drawn by financial desperation and the invisible pull of blood obligation. But he'd left a way out, a counter-ritual that could permanently seal the threshold. The question was, could I trust Cheryl to help me perform it? Or was she, as part of this place, working toward her own ends? I tucked the journal into my waistband, pulling my shirt over it. I needed to find Lambert again, to confirm what I'd read. But first, I had a more immediate concern, figuring out who I could trust, if anyone, in this nightmare facility. Little did I know what waited next, because as I left the archives, I didn't notice the small camera in the upper corner of the room, its red light blinking steadily as it recorded my every move. Somewhere around 4 a.m. on that Thursday, I realized the entire night had blurred by again. When 8 a.m. rolled around, my second shift ended, on paper anyway. But again, I was too wired to get more than a few hours of sleep. Instead, I drifted through the halls, feeding animals, trying to act normal. That Thursday morning, sunlight only made the place seem more surreal. After grabbing another cup of toxic coffee, by early afternoon, I was halfway to the break room to meet Cheryl when a soft hand grabbed my arm, pulling me into a darkened supply closet. I almost yelled before a palm clamped over my mouth. "Shut up," a woman's voice muttered silently. "They're listening everywhere." The hand moved away, and in the dim light filtering under the door, I made out a young woman's face. Sharp features, hollow eyes, wearing green scrubs with a Pinewood ID badge. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Nina Reyes. I worked with your grandfather." She couldn't have been older than 35. Or rather, I worked with what's left of him. What's left? He's not entirely gone. Not completely absorbed. Sometimes we hear him. She tapped her temple. In here. Those of us who spend enough time near the threshold. He's been waiting for you. My skin prickled. You're saying my grandfather's ghost is talking to you? Not a ghost. His consciousness, fragmented but persistent, fighting from within the threshold matrix. Her eyes met mine, intense and a little manic. Don't trust Lambert. Don't trust Cheryl. They both want to use you, just in different ways. And you don't? A bitter smile twisted her lips. I want to die, Mr. Ellis. I volunteered for Experiment 37, genetic reconfiguration. They promised miracles. Instead, I'm becoming something else. Slowly. From the inside out. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing forearm skin mottled with patches of what looked like fine scales. Your grandfather says you can end this. All of it. I stared at her arm, feeling sick. The counter ritual. Yes. But you need to understand something. Closing the threshold won't just stop future experiments. It will undo current ones. She tugged her sleeve down. Including me. Including Emily Vaughn. Including all of us caught between human and other. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You'd die. We'd be released, she corrected fiercely. Do you understand what it's like, feeling yourself disappear piece by piece, replaced by something ancient and hungry? Something that sees humans as livestock? She gripped my shoulders. Death would be a mercy. Before I could respond, she pressed something into my hand, a small vial of dark liquid. Your grandfather's blood, she whispered. They keep samples in the lab. This might help strengthen the counter ritual. Use it if you can. Nina ... I started, not even sure what to say. Go to the break room, meet Cheryl as planned, pretend you know nothing, let her think she's manipulating you. Nina opened the door a crack, peering out. She's Emily's sister, but she doesn't want Emily released. She wants her completed. Completed? The integration process. She thinks if Emily fully transforms, she'll gain powers beyond human limits. Immortality, maybe. Cheryl wants to join her. Nina's expression darkened. She's trying to convince Chambers to let her volunteer too. With that final revelation, she slipped out, leaving me alone in the closet with a vial of my dead grandfather's blood, and the sickening realization that in this place, even family loyalty was a weapon. I waited a few minutes before heading to the break room, my mind racing. Everyone here seemed to want something from me. My blood, my cooperation, my life. And everyone had their own version of the truth, filtered through their own desperate agendas. It was all so confusing. Cheryl was waiting in the break room, pacing nervously. When she saw me, relief washed over her face, or a convincing simulation of it. Did you find what you needed? She asked, voice low. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. The journal. It explains a lot. Then you understand why we need to get you out of here. She glanced at the door. Before the new moon. Before they can use you in the ritual. I understand more than you think, I said carefully. My grandfather wrote about a counter-ritual, a way to permanently close the threshold. Something flickered in her eyes. Alarm, quickly suppressed. That's interesting, but dangerous. Probably impossible. She forced a smile. Our priority should be getting you to safety. What about the others? Emily? The other vessels? Cheryl's expression clouded. My sister is beyond saving. The kindest thing we can do is leave her in peace. Leave her in peace or leave her in pieces? I wondered darkly. Nina's warning echoed in my head. She doesn't want Emily released. She wants her completed. I need to think, I said, buying time. This is a lot to process. Maybe I should stay another night, figure out. No. Cheryl grabbed my arm, then caught herself, softening her grip. I mean, that would be a mistake. They're preparing for the ritual. By tomorrow night, it'll be too late. Too late for what? For me to escape? Or for me to do what my grandfather couldn't? Her eyes narrowed slightly. What exactly did you read in that journal, Mark? Before I could answer, the door opened and Dr. Morrow entered, looking between us with calculating eyes. Ms. Winters, Mr. Ellis, having a staff meeting? Cheryl stepped back, her face an instant mask of professional detachment. Just answering some basic questions about the feeding schedule, Dr. Morrow. How conscientious. Morrow's smile was a bloodless curve of lips. I'm afraid I need to borrow Mr. Ellis. Mr. Chambers would like a word. I kept my face neutral. Of course. Cheryl gave me a warning look before slipping past Dr. Morrow. Remember what I said about the special dietary needs, she called back, our improvised code. Morrow led me through corridors I hadn't seen before, to an office far more lavish than the utilitarian spaces I'd encountered so far. Polished mahogany desk, leather chairs, Persian rug. It looked like the stereotype of an Ivy League dean's office, not part of a facility conducting unspeakable experiments on animals and humans. Mr. Chambers sat behind the desk, examining what looked like brain scans on a tablet. He glanced up as we entered, his face unreadable. Mr. Ellis, please sit. He gestured to a chair opposite him. I understand you've been exploring our facility, finding it illuminating. I sat, fighting to keep my expression neutral. It It's certainly unique. Indeed. He set down the tablet, steepling his fingers. Let's dispense with pretense, shall we? You've discovered what we do here. You've spoken with Lambert, with Cheryl Winters. You've read your grandfather's journal. Fear spiked through me. They'd been watching me all along. You know about the threshold, he continued. About the covenant your ancestors made. About your grandfather's unfortunate end. Unfortunate? I couldn't suppress my anger. You sacrificed him. Used him like a lab animal. We elevated him, Chambers corrected, his voice soft but intense. James Ellis exists now on a plane beyond mundane consciousness. His essence helps maintain the barrier between worlds, a barrier that protects billions of lives. By trapping his consciousness in some kind of interdimensional prison, Dr. Morrow stepped forward. Your grandfather's consciousness wasn't meant to remain intact. The ritual should have fully dissolved his essence into the threshold matrix. Her gaze was detached, but he resisted. His will was exceptional, and his resistance has been weakening the boundary for decades. Good for him, I said, surprising myself with my defiance. Chambers sighed, as if dealing with a particularly slow child. You don't understand what's at stake. The entities beyond the threshold aren't malevolent in any human sense of the word. They simply exist according to different laws, different imperatives. If the barrier falls completely, their reality will bleed into ours. Imagine physics itself changing, molecular bonds dissolving, conscious thought becoming permeable to external influence. So maintain your barrier without sacrificing more people. We've tried. For the first time, Chambers looked genuinely tired. For 40 years, we've used animal vessels, mechanical reinforcements, even synthetic blood compounds designed to mimic Ellis DNA. Nothing works as effectively as the real thing, and the boundary grows thinner every day. Dr. Morrow circled behind me, her voice thoughtful. There was a time when the Ellis bloodline understood its responsibility, when they accepted the honor of their role as guardians. What honor? Being blood bags for your experiments? Chambers' expression hardened. Your great-grandfather, William Ellis, was starving during the Depression. His family was days from losing everything. The entities offered a bargain, prosperity in exchange for service. The Ellis blood would help maintain the boundary, preventing full incursion while allowing controlled contact, a symbiotic relationship. And what did you get out of it? I asked, suddenly seeing the missing piece. The entities weren't negotiating with my great-grandfather. They were dealing with you, with Pinewood. What was your cut? A cold smile touched Chambers' lips. Knowledge, technology, understanding beyond human limits. He lifted a hand, and for a moment I swore his fingers lengthened, bones shifting beneath the skin before settling back to normal proportions. Certain accommodations for those who serve faithfully. Horror washed through me. You're not fully human anymore, are you? I am evolved, he corrected smoothly. As is Dr. Morrow, as are all the senior researchers who've served the threshold long enough. Dr. Morrow smiled, and in that smile I caught a glimpse of something ancient and hungry beneath her human facade. The integration process is beneficial when properly controlled. My mouth went dry. And now you want me to… what? Become like you? Let you sacrifice me to strengthen your precious barrier? Not sacrifice, Chambers said. Elevate. Join us as a guardian. Your blood is uniquely valuable. The direct descendant of James Ellis, carrying genetic markers that interact powerfully with threshold energy. He leaned forward. You could have everything you've ever wanted, Mark. Financial security, purpose, power beyond ordinary human limits. And all it costs is my humanity? Humanity is just a developmental stage, Dr. Morrow said dismissively. A chrysalis to be shed. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process their offer. They wanted me to voluntarily participate in the same ritual that had claimed my grandfather, to willingly surrender myself to the threshold. What about the other options? I asked carefully. Cheryl offered to help me escape. Lambert mentioned a counter-ritual that could close the threshold permanently. Chambers and Morrow exchanged glances. Ms. Winters has her own agenda, Chambers said delicately. Her sister's transformation is incomplete, unstable. She believes your blood will help stabilize Emily's integration, allow her to fully transform without the suffering that currently plagues her. And Lambert? Dr. Morrow's lips thinned. Lambert is an idealist and a hypocrite. His family covenant requires the Lamberts to witness, to ensure ethical boundaries are maintained. But when faced with genuine evolution, genuine transcendence, his nerve failed him. She circled back to stand beside Chambers. The counter-ritual he advocates would indeed close the threshold and kill every vessel, every partially integrated being connected to it, including Emily Vaughn, including Nina Reyes. My head snapped up at Nina's name. They knew about our conversation. Yes, we're aware you spoke with Miss Reyes, Chambers said, reading my expression. Her condition is advancing rapidly. Soon her human consciousness will be completely subsumed. Her fear is understandable, if short-sighted. So everyone here is lying to me, I said flatly. Everyone has their own agenda. Precisely. Chambers smiled thinly. Which is why you should consider our offer carefully. We at least are being transparent about what we want from you. And if I refuse, then we resort to less optimal methods. Chambers' voice was matter-of-fact. Blood taken by force is less effective for the ritual, but still viable. You would not enjoy the experience. The threat hung in the air between us, all pretense of scientific detachment gone. This was no longer a job interview or an orientation. This was an ultimatum. Cooperate or become a sacrifice like my grandfather. I'll need time to think about it, I said, playing for time. Until tomorrow evening, Chambers conceded. The new moon rises at 9:47 p.m. The ritual must begin precisely at moonrise. He stood, signaling the end of our conversation. Consider carefully, Mr. Ellis. This isn't just about you. The barrier's integrity affects billions of lives. Your grandfather's resistance has pushed us to a crisis point. Only Ellis blood can stabilize what James Ellis has destabilized. As Dr. Morrow escorted me out, her hand cold on my elbow, I felt like I was walking through a minefield where every step could be fatal. Everyone here wanted my blood for their own purposes. Chambers to strengthen the barrier, Cheryl to stabilize her sister, Lambert to close the threshold entirely. And what did I want? To escape with my life and my humanity intact? Or to finish what my grandfather started, regardless of the cost? Back in the main hallway, Dr. Morrow leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper. One more thing you should know, Mr. Ellis. The journals you've read, the stories you've heard, they're not the full truth. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind her professional facade. Fear, perhaps, or doubt. Your grandfather's experiment wasn't just about closing the threshold. He wanted to reverse it, to send what had already come through back to where it came from. Isn't that what Lambert's counter-ritual would do? No, Lambert's ritual would seal the threshold, but leave what's already here intact. Your grandfather found something else, a way to purge our world entirely of threshold influence. Her fingers dug into my arm, including those of us who've benefited from it. Why are you telling me this? She glanced over her shoulder, then back at me. Because unlike Chambers, I believe you deserve all the information before making your choice. And because, she hesitated, because I'm not as evolved as I pretended to be. Some nights I still dream as a human woman. Some days I remember having a conscience. Before I could respond, she pulled away, her face resetting to its usual mask of cold detachment. Rest well, Mr. Ellis. Tomorrow will be a significant day for all of us. She walked away, leaving me in the corridor with even more questions than before. I stood there, shaking with a combination of fear and confusion. Was Dr. Morrow trying to help me? Manipulate me? Both? In this place, even apparent acts of kindness seemed poisoned with hidden motives. I needed to find the truth, not filtered through Chambers or Lambert or Cheryl, but the pure, unvarnished reality. And I suspected that truth lay somewhere in my grandfather's research, in whatever he'd discovered about truly reversing the threshold's influence. But where would I find that research? And who, if anyone, could I trust to help me find it? I spent the next few hours checking on the animals in the main ward, partly to maintain my cover as a dedicated employee, partly because their silent suffering grounded me in a way nothing else could. These creatures, some clearly in the early stages of transformation, others still blissfully normal, reminded me why I couldn't just run, couldn't just save myself. In one of the enclosures, I found a beagle mix with eyes that seemed to see right through me. Unlike the other animals, who either cowered or stared with unnerving intelligence, this one simply wagged her tail when I approached. The nameplate read, Sadie. I crouched by her enclosure, making sure she was fully awake before I opened the door. No need for sedation or muzzles here. She trotted out, sniffing my shoes, licking my fingers with a warmth I'd forgotten existed. "Hey there, Sadie," I whispered, stroking her soft ears. "At least one of us is having a good day." She cocked her head as if understanding my words, but mercifully didn't respond. I'd had enough talking animals for one lifetime. As I continued my rounds, letting Sadie follow at my heels, I pieced together what I knew. The threshold was a natural weak point between dimensions. My ancestors had made a covenant to help maintain it, using our blood to stabilize a barrier that kept it from fully opening. Over time, Pinewood had shifted from containment to controlled integration, creating vessels that could house consciousness from beyond. My grandfather had discovered a way to not just seal the threshold, but reverse its effects, to purge our world of entities that had already crossed over. They'd caught him before he could implement it, sacrificing him in a ritual that was supposed to absorb his consciousness into the threshold matrix. But he'd resisted, maintaining his identity within the barrier, actively working against their efforts from within. Now they needed me, either to strengthen the barrier through a ritual similar to what they'd done to my grandfather, or to neutralize his resistance through our shared bloodline. Meanwhile, Cheryl wanted my blood to stabilize her sister's transformation, and Lambert wanted me to perform a counter-ritual that would close the threshold but leave existing integrations intact. And somewhere in this mess of competing agendas was the truth about what my grandfather had really discovered, the key to fully reversing the threshold's influence. Lost in thought, it was already Thursday evening by the time Lambert cornered me in the hall. Dr. Lambert looking even more haggard than before, his wire-rimmed glasses slightly askew. "Mark," he said urgently, "I've been looking for you. We need to talk." I eyed him warily. "About what? More half-truths and manipulations?" He winced. "I deserve that. But right now, we don't have time for recriminations. Chambers is accelerating the timetable. The ritual prep has already begun." Alarm spiked through me. But he said I had until tomorrow evening. He lied. The new moon technically rises just after midnight tomorrow, Thursday night, technically Friday morning. He plans to begin the ritual at precisely 12:01 a.m. Lambert gripped my arm. "We need to get you to the ritual chamber before they do. For your counter-ritual, the one that closes the threshold but leaves the vessels intact." Lambert's eyes narrowed. "What have they told you?" "Enough to know everyone here has their own agenda, including you." I stepped back, putting distance between us. "My grandfather found a way to reverse the threshold completely, didn't he? Not just close it, but undo everything it's done, including whatever enhancements you've gained from it." Lambert's face went completely still. "Who told you that? Does it matter? Is it true?" He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. When he looked up, his eyes had changed, the pupils elongated, inhuman. "Your grandfather was brilliant but reckless. He didn't understand the consequences of what he was proposing." The strange eyes fixed on me. "Do you have any idea what a full reversal would mean? Not just for the vessels, but for everyone who's been influenced by threshold energy over generations. Tell me." "Death, dissolution, a fundamental rewriting of cellular memory." His voice dropped to a hiss. "Including yours, Mark. The Ellis bloodline carries threshold markers going back generations. You think you're fully human? You're as much a hybrid as Emily Vaughn, just more subtly altered." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "You're lying. am I? How do you think your blood can affect the threshold at all? Pure humans can't interact with it directly. Only those already touched by it can influence it. His face softened with what looked like genuine pity. This isn't about preserving my enhancements, as you call them. It's about preventing a catastrophe that would kill thousands, including you. My head spun with the implications. Could I trust anything Lambert told me? Was I really not fully human? If my grandfather knew this, I said slowly, why would he pursue the reversal anyway? Because he was dying already, Lambert replied grimly. The initial ritual damaged him on a cellular level. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain by taking the entities with him. He stepped closer. But you're not dying, Mark. You have a future, if you choose wisely. Sadie growled suddenly, her hackles rising as she positioned herself between me and Lambert. For a normal dog, it was an unnervingly perceptive response. Lambert's strange eyes flicked to her. Smart animal, already bonding with you through blood recognition. He straightened. You need to decide, Mark. Help me close the threshold cleanly, or let Chambers complete what he started with your grandfather. Those are the only viable options. What about Cheryl's plan? Escaping? A bitter laugh escaped him. You can't escape the Covenant. The Ellis bloodline is bound to this place. You'd find yourself drawn back, through dreams, through coincidences, through 1,000 subtle manipulations of probability. Your grandfather tried to run before he decided to fight. It nearly drove him mad. I looked down at Sadie, still protectively positioned between us, and made a split-second decision. I need to see the ritual chamber, to understand what I'm dealing with. Lambert's inhuman eyes gleamed with something like triumph. I can take you there. Now, while Chambers is occupied with preparations elsewhere. Give me 30 minutes, I said. I need to check on the other animals first. He hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The southeast stairwell, level B3, 30 minutes. He turned to leave, then paused. And Mark, whatever you decide, remember that intentions matter in threshold magic. Blood given with the wrong intent can have unexpected consequences. After he left, I knelt beside Sadie, my thoughts racing. Lambert's revelation about my own humanity, or partial lack thereof, had shaken me to my core. Was I already something other than human? Was that why I'd always felt different, disconnected? What do you think, girl? I whispered to the beagle. Who's telling the truth here? Sadie just licked my hand, her warm tongue a reminder of simplicity in this maze of confusion. I needed more information before meeting Lambert, information uncorrupted by anyone's agenda, and I had a feeling I knew where to find it. If my grandfather had discovered a way to reverse the threshold completely, he wouldn't have trusted that information to just one source. He would have hidden backup copies, insurance against exactly the kind of manipulation I was experiencing. The most logical place for such a backup? The one area no one had mentioned, perhaps because they didn't know about it. The office where I'd found the daily log. My grandfather's old workspace. I headed there immediately, Sadie trotting at my heels. The cramped office looked exactly as I'd left it. Ancient computer, battered desk, daily log sitting open. But now I searched more carefully, looking for hiding places a desperate man might use to conceal his most valuable discovery. Under the desk, behind the filing cabinet, inside ancient reference books. Nothing. I was ready to give up when Sadie began pawing at a section of baseboard that looked slightly discolored. I knelt to investigate and found a loose panel that pulled away easily. Behind it was a small cavity containing a sealed plastic bag. Inside the bag, a weathered flash drive and a handwritten note dated September 6, 1984, the day before my grandfather's final journal entry. To whoever finds this, most likely another Ellis, drawn back to Pinewood by the Covenant. This drive contains the complete reversal protocol, including the modified ritual words and blood-binding technique. I've hidden identical copies throughout the facility. The reversal will undo all threshold influence, returning our reality to its original state. This means death for those significantly altered, including me if they succeed in their ritual tomorrow. It may mean death for you too, depending on your threshold saturation level. This is not a decision to make lightly, but I believe it's the only way to truly free our bloodline and end the abominations Pinewood has created in the name of progress. The choice is yours, but know this: blood given in perfect knowledge, with absolute intent, is the most powerful force in threshold manipulation. Whatever you decide completely. James Ellis. I pocketed the flash drive, my grandfather's words echoing in my mind. The choice is yours, but decide completely. No wonder everyone here had been feeding me partial truths, manipulating my understanding. The power of the ritual depended on my intent, my knowledge. Complete knowledge meant I could make a genuine choice, not one clouded by others' agendas. I checked my watch. 20 minutes until I was supposed to meet Lambert. Just enough time to visit one more person, Emily Vaughn. If I was going to make a choice that might determine her fate, I owed her the dignity of asking what she wanted. With Sadie still at my side, I made my way cautiously back to the isolation ward. The high-risk area was deserted, everyone presumably occupied with ritual preparations. I moved directly to Emily's tarp-covered enclosure and gently lifted the edge. Emily lay curled in the corner, her partly human, partly feline form shuddering with each labored breath. Her eyes, those hauntingly human eyes in her hybrid face, opened as I approached. "Ellis," she rasped, recognition dawning. "You came back. I need to ask you something, Emily," I said softly. "The truth. Do you want to be completed, fully transformed? Or do you want to be released even if that means death?" She gave a wheezing laugh that turned into a cough. "What kind of life is this? Trapped between worlds, mind human, body becoming something else." Her gaze intensified. "My sister. She thinks she's saving me. She's wrong. And Lambert? Chambers? Their plans?" Emily's hybrid features contorted with what might have been contempt. "Lambert wants to preserve his power. Chambers wants to become a god." She dragged herself closer to the bars. "Your grandfather found the truth. Only complete reversal will end this abomination. Even if it kills you, kills me, we're already dying, Ellis." Her eyes filled with tears that looked shockingly human against her transforming face. "Just slowly, painfully, this way, we take the monsters with us." A noise from the corridor made me drop the tarp quickly. Footsteps approached, then passed by. When they faded, I lifted the tarp again. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for the truth." Emily's lips pulled back in a grimace or smile. "Find the chamber in the bedrock. Speak the words, backward, blood freely given, with perfect intent." Her eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming her. "End this, Ellis. Please." I let the tarp fall, my decision crystallizing. Emily's suffering, my grandfather's sacrifice, the horror of what Pinewood had become. All of it demanded action. Not Lambert's half measure, not Chambers' continuation of the abomination, but a true reversal, a cleansing. But first, I needed to see the ritual chamber, to understand the battlefield before engaging the enemy. I made my way to the southeast stairwell, Sadie still following loyally. Level B3 was accessed by a heavy metal door that required key card access. I tried Lambert's card, half expecting it to fail, but the lock clicked open. The corridor beyond was different from anything I'd seen in the facility so far. The walls were stone, not concrete, with ancient-looking symbols carved into their surface. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with something that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Sadie whined, pressing closer to my legs. Even she could feel the wrongness of this place. Lambert stood waiting at the far end, his face tight with impatience. "You're late," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the stone passage. "And you brought the dog." "Unwise." "She stays with me," I said firmly. "Where's the chamber?" He gestured to a massive stone archway carved with symbols similar to those on the walls but more complex, more deliberate. "Through there. But before we enter, I need your commitment, Mark. The counter-ritual requires absolute intent." "Show me first," I countered. "Then we'll talk intent." Something flickered across his face. Frustration, perhaps, or calculation. But he nodded curtly and led me through the archway. The chamber beyond was circular, with a domed ceiling that seemed impossibly high. In the center stood a raised stone platform, ancient and weathered, carved with channels that converged at a central depression. Around the perimeter, more symbols were carved into the walls, similar to those in the corridor, but more elaborate. "This place predates Pinewood by centuries," Lambert said quietly. "Indigenous peoples built it as a containment structure long before European settlers arrived. Your great-grandfather didn't discover the threshold. He simply found what others had been guarding for generations." I approached the central platform, studying its intricate carvings. The stone felt warm beneath my fingers, as if pulsing with its own life. "And the ritual?" I asked. "How does it work?" Lambert moved to stand beside me. Blood freely given, placed in the central depression. Words spoken, the ones carved above the archway. For maintenance, spoken forward. For closure, spoken backward. And for reversal? His head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing. "There is no reversal ritual. It's a myth, a desperate fantasy James concocted as he was losing his mind." Liar, I thought, but kept my face neutral. "Just curious." He seemed to relax slightly. "The closure ritual will end the abominations, Mark. No more vessels being created. No more entities crossing over. Isn't that enough? What about Emily? The others already transformed. They remain as they are, contained, studied. Their suffering managed through medication." His voice turned persuasive. "It's the most humane solution. Complete reversal is a fairy tale, and even if it weren't, it would be mass murder." Lambert's patience finally snapped. His vehemence told me everything I needed to know. He was lying, and terrified of what my grandfather had discovered. "I think we're done here," I said quietly, backing toward the chamber entrance with Sadie at my heels. "I need time to think." "We don't have time," Lambert growled, his voice changing, deepening to something less than human. "The ritual begins at midnight. Chambers will use you whether you consent or not. Then I'll see you before midnight," I promised, edging toward the archway. With my decision, I turned to leave, only to find the entrance blocked by 3 figures: Chambers, Dr. Morrow, and Cheryl. Their expressions ranged from cold calculation to desperate hope to bitter triumph. "I believe," said Chambers smoothly, "that the time for decisions has passed, Mr. Ellis." Lambert moved to stand beside them, his transformation to inhuman ally complete. I tried to reason with him. "He knows about the reversal theory." "Of course he does," Dr. Morrow sighed. "The Ellis stubbornness is genetic, apparently." Cheryl stepped forward, her eyes pleading. "Mark, please. My sister is suffering. Your blood can stabilize her, end her pain. Isn't that better than killing her with some untested reversal that might not even work?" I looked between them. These 4 people with their competing agendas, all united now in preventing me from implementing my grandfather's discovery. 4 against 1, with only a beagle as my ally. But I had one advantage they didn't know about. I'd made my decision with full knowledge and absolute intent. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. Blood given in perfect knowledge, with absolute intent, is the most powerful force in threshold manipulation. "I'll cooperate," I said suddenly. They exchanged startled glances. "You will?" Chambers asked suspiciously. "On one condition." I steeled myself. "I want to see my grandfather, or what's left of him." Dr. Morrow frowned. "That's not possible. His physical body was completely absorbed into the threshold matrix. Then show me the threshold itself, the actual gateway. If I'm going to give my blood for this ritual, I want to understand exactly what I'm affecting." Chambers considered this, his cold gaze assessing me. A reasonable request, actually. The threshold manifestation chamber is adjacent to this ritual space. He nodded to Lambert. "Prepare the equipment. We'll proceed as soon as Mr. Ellis has his educational experience." Lambert looked like he wanted to protest, but nodded stiffly and left. Cheryl moved to follow him, shooting me a confused, hopeful glance as she passed. Chambers gestured toward a smaller archway on the chamber's far side. "After you, Mr. Ellis." I followed him through the arch, Sadie sticking close to my heels despite Dr. Morrow's attempts to shoo her away. The space beyond was smaller than the ritual chamber but similarly constructed. Stone walls, domed ceiling, ancient symbols. But where the ritual chamber had the raised platform at its center, this room contained what looked like a massive vertical pool of mercury, suspended impossibly in midair. The pool rippled and shifted like liquid, but remained perfectly contained within an invisible boundary. Its surface reflected the room in distorted fragments, occasional flashes of other places, other realities, visible in its depths. The threshold, Chambers said reverently. The boundary between our world and what lies beyond, normally invisible to human perception. But here, in this chamber, it manifests physically. I approached cautiously, drawn by an inexplicable pull that felt both familiar and alien. As I drew closer, the surface of the threshold rippled more intensely, as if responding to my presence. It recognizes you, Dr. Morrow observed. Ellis blood calls to it. Within the shifting surface, shapes began to form. Not reflections, but actual entities pressing against the barrier from the other side. Forms that defied description, that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that hurt my eyes to witness. And then, shockingly clear amid the chaos, a human face emerged, stern features softened by eyes that looked precisely like mine. My grandfather. James, Chambers breathed, genuine surprise in his voice. He never manifests this clearly. My grandfather's face regarded me with an intensity that transcended the bizarre medium of his appearance. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Speak the words backward. Blood freely given with intent to reverse, not just close. The Ellis line ends with you, but so does the abomination. Dr. Morrow stepped closer, fascinated. Remarkable clarity. He's never communicated so directly before. My grandfather's gaze shifted to her, his expression hardening. He raised a hand, or what approximated a hand within the threshold matrix, and pointed accusingly. The message was clear. She is one of them. Changed. Corrupted. Chambers gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging in painfully. Enough sightseeing. The ritual preparations are complete, and the new moon rises in 20 minutes. I allowed him to guide me away from the threshold, but not before meeting my grandfather's gaze one last time. His lips formed what might have been "thank you," before his face dissolved back into the shifting chaos of the barrier. They led me back to the ritual chamber, where Lambert and Cheryl waited alongside 3 security guards in Pinewood uniforms. The central platform had been prepared, candles placed at strategic points, a silver bowl positioned at the central depression, an ornate knife resting beside it. Atmospheric, I commented, trying to hide my racing thoughts behind sarcasm. Tradition has its place, Chambers replied without irony. The ritual words are more effective when all aspects of the original covenant are honored. Dr. Morrow approached with a syringe. This will ensure you remain calm during the procedure. I stepped back. No drugs. You said my blood needed to be freely given. That means clear-headed consent. Mr. Ellis, she began, but Chambers interrupted. He's right. The efficacy depends on willing participation. He gestured dismissively, and she put away the syringe. Besides, I believe Mr. Ellis has made his choice. Haven't you? I nodded slowly. I have. Excellent. Chambers smiled thinly. Then let us proceed. He gestured me toward the platform. I climbed the stone steps, Sadie attempting to follow until one of the guards pulled her back. She growled but didn't bite. Smart dog. Lambert stood beside the platform, a large tome open in his hands. I will recite the maintenance words, he explained. You will repeat them, then offer your blood into the bowl. Simple enough. And the blood? I asked, eyeing the ornate knife. A small cut on your palm will suffice, Chambers assured me. Dramatic exsanguination is unnecessary. He joined me on the platform, positioning me at the center. Dr. Morrow and Cheryl watched from the chamber's edge, their expressions revealing their divergent hopes. Morrow's clinical satisfaction, Cheryl's desperate anticipation. Begin, Chambers commanded Lambert. Lambert started to recite in a language I'd never heard but somehow understood, words that seemed to vibrate in my bones, that made the air thick and difficult to breathe, the maintenance words. I listened carefully, memorizing their cadence, their structure. These were the words I would need to speak backward for the reversal ritual. When Lambert finished, he looked at me expectantly. "Repeat the words, Mark." I took a deep breath, centering myself. Blood given in perfect knowledge, with absolute intent. My grandfather's warning echoed in my mind. "Actually," I said calmly, "I think I'll try something different." Before anyone could react, I snatched the ritual knife and sliced my palm deeply, much deeper than the small cut Chambers had mentioned. Blood welled immediately, dripping onto the stone. Then I began to speak the words backward, not stammering or hesitating, but with perfect pronunciation, as if I'd known this language my entire life. Blood from my cut hand flowed into the carved channels, racing toward the central depression with unnatural speed. "Stop him!" Chambers shouted, lunging for me. But it was too late. My blood reached the center as I spoke the final reversed word, my intent crystal clear. Not maintenance, not closure, but complete reversal. The undoing of everything the threshold had influenced. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The stone beneath my feet shuddered like a living thing. The carved channels filled with my blood began to glow with an intense blue light. The symbols on the walls flared blindingly bright. From somewhere beyond perception came a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a sigh, as if something vast and ancient was both dying and being born. The air rippled like heat waves over asphalt, and at the center of the chamber, directly above the platform, a tear appeared in reality itself. It wasn't a physical thing, not a hole or a portal in any conventional sense. It was an absence, a place where the rules of our world simply ceased to apply. Through it, I glimpsed something, shapes and colors that had no names in human language, movements that followed laws of physics I couldn't comprehend, and faces, so many faces, pressed against that thin membrane between worlds. Some appeared almost human, others so alien they hurt to look at directly. All of them fixated on the chamber, on me, with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "What have you done?" Chambers roared, his human facade slipping to reveal something ancient and terrified beneath. His skin rippled like the surface of the threshold itself, features shifting between human and other with nauseating speed. Dr. Morrow collapsed to her knees, her body contorting as if fighting against itself. "The reversal," she gasped. "It's happening." Lambert staggered back, dropping his tome as his hands transformed before my eyes, elongating, the fingers fusing, skin hardening into chitinous claws. "You fool. You've killed us all." Only Cheryl seemed relatively unaffected, though she screamed her sister's name and tried to run for the door, only to be blocked by the security guards, who were themselves beginning to transform in hideous ways, their uniforms splitting as their bodies expanded and twisted. The tear in reality began to constrict, its edges pulling inward like a closing iris. The faces on the other side grew more frantic, pressing harder against the thinning barrier. Some seemed desperate to break through, others equally desperate to retreat. And then, from within that swirling chaos, a single form emerged, not physically passing through, but somehow projecting itself partially into our reality. A man in his 40s, with my eyes and my jawline, wearing clothes from another era. My grandfather. "Mark," he said, his voice sounding like it came from underwater and outer space simultaneously. "You've done it. The threshold is closing." "Grandfather?" I whispered, scarcely believing what I was seeing. He nodded, a sad smile crossing features that shifted like smoke in wind. "I've been waiting for this, fighting from within, keeping the barrier from becoming a doorway." His gaze moved to Chambers and the others, who were transforming more rapidly now, their human forms sloughing away to reveal the entities that had been hiding within them. They never understood. The Covenant wasn't meant to create vessels or soldiers or weapons. It was a stopgap, a temporary measure until the threshold could be properly sealed. "Ellis," Chambers growled, his voice no longer remotely human. "You've doomed your own bloodline. Your own species. I've honored the true purpose of my lineage, my grandfather replied. We were never meant to be gateways, Michael. We were meant to be locks. The tear continued to shrink, the light from the symbols growing impossibly bright. My grandfather's form began to fade, becoming transparent. Grandfather, wait, I called. What happens now? What happens to the vessels, to Emily and the others? His expression turned sorrowful. They'll be freed, Mark. Their human consciousness released, the entities sent back beyond the threshold. It will be painful, but brief, and then peace. As if to confirm his words, a scream echoed from somewhere in the facility, inhuman in its volume and pitch, yet carrying unmistakable relief beneath the agony. And you? I asked. What happens to you? I go with the threshold as I must, but willingly this time and whole. He began to dissipate further, his form becoming one with the collapsing tear in reality. You've broken the covenant, Mark. Broken it properly this time. Our bloodline is free. With those final words, he vanished completely. The tear contracted to a pinpoint of light, then disappeared with a sound like a massive thunderclap. The symbols on the walls flared one last time, then faded to dull, ordinary carvings in stone. Around me, the transformations accelerated. Chambers, Morrow, and Lambert were barely recognizable now, their bodies twisting into forms that defied description, caught between human and other. They writhed on the chamber floor, unholy sounds escaping what remained of their mouths. Only Cheryl remained unchanged, backing against the wall in horror as she watched the guards dissolve into puddles of organic matter that bubbled and steamed before evaporating entirely. What have you done? She screamed at me. Emily, my sister. She's free now, I said quietly. Released from suffering, she begged to end. The chamber shuddered violently, dust raining from the ceiling. The floor beneath our feet trembled like an earthquake had struck. The threshold was a supporting structure for this entire facility, Cheryl said numbly, her scientific knowledge asserting itself even through her grief. With it gone, the place is coming down, I realized. We need to leave. Now. I jumped down from the platform, calling for Sadie, who bounded to my side unaffected by the chaos around us. Pure animals, it seemed, were immune to the reversal's effects. Only those integrated with threshold entities were being purged. Cheryl's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of hatred and desperate survival instinct. Without a word, she turned and ran for the exit. I followed with Sadie, leaving Chambers, Morrow, and Lambert to whatever fate the reversal had decreed for them. We made our way through corridors that were rapidly disintegrating, up emergency stairs as elevators failed, past enclosures where former vessels lay unconscious or dead, the entities that had partially inhabited them now gone. The main floor was chaos, staff running in all directions, alarms blaring, emergency lights flashing. Through it all, I held on to Sadie, determined that if I'd managed to break the covenant, I'd damn well survive to enjoy my freedom. As we reached the main entrance, the building gave a massive groan like a dying beast. The floor buckled beneath our feet, walls cracking from floor to ceiling. Run, I shouted, pulling Sadie toward the door. We burst outside into the cool night air, the new moon invisible in the black sky above. Behind us, Pinewood County Animal Rescue collapsed into rubble, generations of horror and abuse finally ending in dust and debris. In the parking lot, I spotted my battered Chevy where I'd left it just 3 nights ago, though it felt like years had passed. What had begun as a desperate job search, my bank account at $43.17 and rent overdue, had morphed into a nightmare of ancient covenants and family legacy. The immediate start and competitive pay that had lured me here had been bait for something far darker. I opened the door for Sadie, who jumped in without hesitation. 3 nights of sleeping in the cramped break room on a cot that smelled of antiseptic and fear had left me longing for my own bed, however humble. Before I could climb in myself, a hand gripped my arm. Cheryl, her face streaked with tears and dust. You murdered my sister, she said, voice shaking with rage. You murdered everyone in there. I freed them, I corrected gently. From suffering they didn't choose. You had no right. Her fingers dug into my arm. The research, the discoveries, it could have changed humanity forever. It was changing humanity, I agreed, into something that wasn't human at all. She released me suddenly, shoulders slumping in defeat. What happens now? To those of us who survive? I looked back at the ruins of Pinewood, the concrete bunker now just a pile of rubble in the moonless night. Somewhere in that destruction lay the bodies of vessels who had finally found peace, the research of decades that should never have been conducted, and the physical remains of a covenant that had bound my family for generations. We live, I said simply. As humans, with all our flaws and limitations, it's not so bad. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away from Pinewood County without looking back. Beside me, Sadie rested her head on my lap, a warm reminder that some connections don't require blood covenants or interdimensional bargains, just simple compassion and the choice to care for something smaller than yourself. The job that had promised to solve my financial problems had lasted barely 72 hours. No paycheck would be forthcoming from a facility that now existed only as rubble. I was still broke, still adrift, but somehow lighter, as if the weight of an inheritance I'd never known about had been lifted from my shoulders. In the darkness, as the cornfields whispered secrets I could no longer understand, I wondered if I had done the right thing. If the cost, Emily, my grandfather, countless others caught in the threshold's influence, had been worth the freedom I'd purchased. Wednesday and Thursday had passed in a blur. Now, as Friday dawned with me fleeing the collapsing facility, I realized I'd spent exactly 3 days inside Pinewood's walls. 3 days that had changed everything. My father would have said I'd failed again, walked away from a job after just 3 days, with nothing to show for it but nightmares and a rescued dog. He'd have seen it as one more entry in my lifelong catalog of disappointments. But for once, I didn't hear his voice in my head, criticizing my choices. Perhaps breaking the Ellis Covenant had freed me from more than just Pinewood's horrors. I had no answers, only the road stretching ahead and a dog who needed me. No competitive pay, no security, just the knowledge that I'd fulfilled a duty far older and more significant than a mere job. For now, that would have to be enough. As the miles accumulated between us and that place, I thought about my father's 2 lessons. Follow the damn rules, and dogs don't talk back. He'd been wrong about both. Sometimes rules must be broken and sometimes dogs do talk, though what they have to say may be the last thing you want to hear. That's the end of this story. If you enjoyed the video, subscribing to my channel would help me out more than you can imagine. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon.